Number 5, Leviticus, in the series The Picture of God in All 66 by Graham Maxwell, recorded October 1983.
Tonight, Leviticus, and next time, Numbers, and just some suggested questions and subjects you might want to concentrate on, though please don't be limited by this. You know, Numbers records the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, when God allowed a whole generation who didn't have enough faith in him to let him take them into Canaan his way. He allowed them to die off. Rather reminds one of Ellen White's comment that those of more mature years are generally as insensible to new impressions as is the hardened rock. The time to influence people is when they're young. So the older generation was allowed to die off. Lest one be depressed by that quotation, it says those of more mature years are generally. We could be the exception, you see, and don't you know some at 90 who are still willing to listen and accept a new idea? But the question is, at the end of the 40 years, was the next generation any better? Now, they thought they were. Perhaps they didn't even think they had done too badly during the 40 years, because in the book of Joshua, coming up after Deuteronomy, the people said to Joshua, "Be of good courage, just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you." I think his heart would sink. So they evidently didn't think they had done too badly during this period. But we want to know about God. Why would God proceed if the next generation was not much better? In fact, he comments on it. He's taking them in not because they're any better, but he wants to say something about himself. Say what about himself? Do you remember in Ezekiel, it's mentioned several times that God is bringing the captives home from Babylon not because they're any better, but because he must say something about himself. The same as with the plagues of Egypt, he was saying something about himself. Is it not true in those days that you could hardly expect a God to be revered who didn't win once in a while? The heathen would not reverence a losing God. So why would anybody respect the God of the Israelites? And so every once in a while, God would say, I have to do something to reestablish respect so that people will be willing to listen and don't think it's because you're any better. And I think this is a very important point as we go through the Bible as to why God does certain things at certain times. Now, also in Numbers, we have the story of Moses smiting the rock. And God seems to deal with him so severely. When you have a record of God dealing with one of his best friends, we really have evidence as to the kind of person God is. But what do you think of the severity? The irritation was extreme, wasn't it? And Moses lost his temper and misrepresented God at the rock. And God said, for that you may not go into the land of Canaan. And some feel God is very severe there. He seemed to forgive the people for much worse behavior. Well, one needs to look ahead to Deuteronomy, or at least to remember what's there also. And then one needs to look ahead to the Mount of Transfiguration. Who came down to encourage the Son of God? And if you can read Patriarchs and Prophets, God gave Moses a preview of the whole history of the great controversy. And he was even told he'd have the privilege of opening the gates to let Jesus in on Resurrection Sunday. Now, how is God treating his friend? What did Moses do that was so damaging that he couldn't, after all those years, go into the land of Canaan? And he begged God over and over till finally God said, speak to me no more of this matter. What is the sin, you see? So that's really worth considering next time. And we'll have a further opportunity in Deuteronomy. We also will have the story of Balaam. What's the message in that story? A miracle, the donkey that talked, you remember? Had more sense than Balaam did? Or does it lie perhaps in this? Balaam asked God if he could curse Israel. And God said, absolutely not. And he begged him again. Certainly not. Third time he begged him, persevering in prayer, as we say one ought to do. And the third time, God said, yes, you may go ahead. Though say what I tell you. He may let us have our own way. It's really worth considering, that story of Balaam. And we should save our discussion till next time. What about the test for jealousy? Now, forbid this should happen in the West Covina area or all of Southern California, that one of you men should be slightly suspicious that your wife is not being true. Do you know how to test that? Read the book of Numbers. I wonder if anybody will want to try that after reading it. But the question is, what does it say about God, as always? But now going on with Leviticus, there are some points left over from Exodus we need to consider. And this little extra note on the side, since we've talked about versions available for our study, did you see in Newsweek, October 24, the article entitled "Scrubbing the Scriptures"? You've undoubtedly heard reports from time to time of efforts to take away the chauvinistic orientation of the Bible. God is He. The Sabbath was made for man. And many other such verses. Well, they've been trying for years to take this out of the Bible, but it's very difficult to rephrase it. Here's an update. There is now prepared a lectionary, a collection of passages from Scripture, the Old Testament, and the Gospels to be read on Sunday. And this lectionary eliminates what it calls sexist, male-oriented language. The article begins, "In the beginning, men created the Bible and made it in their own image. God the Father, God the Son. Last week, a committee of the National Council of Churches sought to bring men's kingdom to an end, releasing a provisional and experimental lectionary. That is, a book of scripture lessons and gospel readings with biblical texts scrubbed clean of sexist, male-oriented language, including all references to a solely masculine deity," and so on. Many of you may take Newsweek and will be able to read this, but some of the renderings are extraordinary. One that may be rather interesting for tonight: how to refer to God. God, my mother and father. So when Jesus addresses his Father, he prays, "God, my mother and father." But most pertinent to tonight, since it refers to Old Testament times, when the Jews said to Jesus, "We have Abraham as our father," it now reads, "We have Abraham as our father and Sarah and Hagar as our mothers." That's how it reads. But there you do have the history of not only the Jews, but the Arabs. Well, you might be interested in reading the rest of this, and I won't read the first words of Genesis that are here and some words of Jesus that are here. You might like to take a look. One other thing from Exodus, on the training of Moses, we often fill in the details as to how Moses was trained for his position and became a highly educated, highly privileged individual in the court of Pharaoh. And this morning in class, a class that's largely freshman dental students, one individual raised the question, in Exodus, I don't see much mention of Moses' experience there. Where do we get all these details? Do they come, say, from patriarchs and prophets? And another student, right on the ball at that time, said, no, many of those details come from Stephen's speech in Acts 7. And it's true. You'll get more about that period in Moses' life from Stephen's speech in the 7th chapter of Acts than you will in Exodus. And I mention that because this is something we need to remember in spelling out the details of other stories. Often the details are not where you expect to find them. They may even be in the Psalms. There are a number of Psalms, aren't there, that give quite a detailed history of the experiences of Israel. And some of the details come from there. And then there are other presentations in the Bible of the history of Israel. The summation of Stephen, he gave a wonderful review of highlights of the Old Testament. You need to look there. How about the fact that when Abraham was promised a son, he considered his own body carefully, now as good as dead, and the deadness of Sarah's womb, but wavered not because he realized that God the Creator who brought everything out of nothing, could obviously create and give him a son. That's in Romans. It's not in Genesis. So one really has to take the Bible as a whole just to tell the stories of the patriarchs, even in the story of Israel. And there are other places. No, they're not like that. Some details are in Hebrews. Hebrews 11 fills in a few details about the behavior of the patriarchs. But now last time, in Exodus, we had the building of the tabernacle. And of course, Leviticus begins with the tabernacle built and the services begin, and there are further details. Have you ever seen a model of the Old Testament tabernacle? Oh, many have seen one. This morning I was hardly prepared, though, for 4 students to say they had each of them contributed to the building of a tabernacle. They had worked on it in detail. I was rather pleased they had that background. In their New Testament classes in academy, their Bible teachers had suggested, well, let's make one. And one student said it lasted for 2 years. They had it on some device that would pull it up to the ceiling until next time they pull it back down and work on it some more. What did it really look like? I meant to bring a book down, but I chose to bring another one instead. I'll bring it next time. You should see the pictures of the tabernacle prepared by the Jews themselves. It looks surprisingly different, and I will not forget to bring it next time. Magnificent, but there are some variations in its shape and not the size, because we have the size, don't we? Or do we know how big a cubit is for sure? Of course, the size is not the important thing. Not even the rooms and the courtyard and the furnishings and the draperies. It's the meaning of it, isn't it? It's what went on there. God didn't have to do it in the tabernacle. He could have done it anywhere. He chose, though, to do it this way. And Moses was told to model it after the pattern that was given him in the mount, which sometimes leads people to assume that up in heaven they have a tabernacle, it's just a little bigger and a little grander. Well, how much bigger would it need to be? In Daniel 7, when the court sits in judgment and the books are open, how many are watching? 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands. That's 100 million. Now, how big would it need to be for everyone to watch? We have to beware that lest we make both our God and his temple too small. We don't even know it looks exactly like the one down here. It's the meaning that counts. We know God has been explaining things to the angels since the great controversy began. And whatever methods are appropriate for clarifying the questions that the angels had, God would be using. But we need to put this on a very grand scale. Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of a house will you build for me, says the Lord. So I don't think we need to worry too much about just what it looks like up there. But if we get the meaning of what happened down here, that represents what's going on up there, and that's extremely important. But is that what the Jews got from this? How did we learn what the tabernacle represented and what the services stood for? Did you find in reading Leviticus there is a clear explanation? Does it say this equals this and that equals that? It doesn't, does it? Or did you find anything? Well, then did they never understand correctly? Did anybody in the Bible understand? Well, which book in the New Testament has particularly helped us to understand? That'd be Hebrews, wouldn't it, especially? It's not the only place. Hebrews helps us. But there's another place that might surprise some. Romans helps us, because Romans 3 refers to a piece of the furnishings in the tabernacle in a rather remarkable verse. In Romans 3, 25 and 26, which explains why Jesus had to die, it says in our King James Version that by dying he became the propitiation. Now we wonder what a propitiation is. Well, propitiation means appeasement. Propitiation is the sort of thing a husband does when he's promised to be home at 6 o'clock on his anniversary to take his wife out for a very special evening. And instead, he's off playing basketball with his friends, and at 11 o'clock, horror seizes him when he realizes his wife has been all dressed up at home since 6 o'clock, ready to go. Now, what do? Can you speak from experience, anybody? Well, you head for home, and to your great relief, there's an all-night florist, which would be rather rare, and you don't buy 2 roses or a dozen. 2 dozen red roses. I mean, nothing will be enough for this emergency. And then, to your delight, there's a pharmacy open, and you buy the most expensive chocolates you can find, maybe these Lady Godivas, you know. Have you ever priced a Lady Godiva? That's the kind of chocolate. You first lock the door, tell your wife that you will not answer the phone or speak to anyone for 10 minutes, and you pop one in your mouth as it gradually melts away. It's quite an experience. Well, if you can find Lady Godivas, you will take those with you. Finally, you arrive at the door, and hesitatingly, you start in, and there's your wife. And you hand her the roses, and you hand her the chocolates, and you make your excuses. You know what you're attempting? Propitiation. You are trying to appease the righteous wrath of an offended wife. Do we have to do things to propitiate the wrath of our God? He's trying to win us. We don't have to win him. But that verse says, Christ, by dying, became the propitiation. But there is a very helpful thing to know about that word. That word in Greek is the word used by the Jews when they translated the Old Testament into Greek for the cover of the ark that we call the mercy seat. In other words, when Jesus died, he became our mercy seat. Do you have a version that says that in Romans 3:25? There are some that do. But now let's go back the other way around. And what about that sacred box? God said to Moses, as you make that box and you make those angels to stand above, and by the way, is that a violation of thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image of anything in the heavens above, but I want you to make graven images of angels? It isn't the making of the images, is it? It's thou shalt not bow down to them and serve them. That's the difference, isn't it? Don't make gods out of them. Because God said, make a couple of angels here that we have up in heaven. Now, those angels were on top of the sacred box, the ark. What kept them from falling in? There was a cover. We call it the mercy seat. And we can just imagine God saying to Moses, take gold and make a mercy seat. I'll have to tell you that when you get to heaven and ask Moses about the mercy seat, he's going to say, mercy seat? I don't know what that was. We didn't have any chairs in there. The mercy seat, that was put on top of the ark. Oh, you mean the lid, the cover? For that's the Hebrew word. God said, just make a lid, make a cover. It comes from the Hebrew word to cover. And if you take that verb to cover and put it in a certain form, it becomes Kippur, as in Yom Kippur. Was that not celebrated by our friends next door in the synagogue? The day of, we say the day of atonement. That is, it's a day of reunion, of peace, of restoration to oneness, a day of at-one-ment, you see. And that's the whole idea, that God was there wanting to restore peace between his rebellious children and himself, to win them back to love and faith and worship and a willingness to listen. And he would treat them so generously. So this lid was in the place where this would happen, and underneath the 10 Commandments were there, weren't they? And we have not lived lives in harmony with those commandments. And if God were to leave us, we would die. Above is the Shekinah, representing the way God is in heaven with a covering angel on either side. 2 light bearers, one his son and one, originally, the light bearer now called Satan. So that's to make us think of heaven. And in between there was this lid, this covering. And since in the most holy place such important things happened, where that covering was, the covering came to take on very special meaning. Not just a lid, but it was a place where reconciliation and at-one-ment happened. When the Jews were scattered, you remember, 10 tribes to the north have gone into oblivion, and the 2 tribes to the south went into the discipline of Babylonian captivity, later to return. Some Jews fled to Egypt. In fact, many. In the time of Christ, it's estimated there were more Jews in Egypt than in Palestine. And they began to change their spoken language. The language of that area was Greek. So they picked up Greek instead of Hebrew. And the Jewish fathers were concerned that the young people growing up in Judaism could no longer read or hear and understand the Bible. So it was reluctantly decided to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. Now, this would have to be very carefully done. You know how carefully the Jews copied Hebrew manuscripts. You've read stories about it. It's unbelievable care that was exercised. They even knew the middle word and the middle letter of a book. And if it didn't come out correctly in the end, they would destroy it. They wouldn't say, well, reduce the price on that one. It was too important. They would destroy. As a manuscript got old, they would destroy it out of reverence and respect for the accuracy of the text. And that's why we don't have very old Hebrew manuscripts. Old Greek ones, but not the ones the Jews produced. It's evidence of their respect and reverence. So what about a translation? You know, translations introduce all kinds of ideas, so how could they make them all accurate? The legend is they took 70 Jewish scholars, put them in 70 separate cells, and they all went to work. And when they were through, they had 70 translations of the Hebrew into Greek, and you know what? All 70 were exactly the same. That's where the Septuagint came from. That's the Testament according to the 70. And it's all a legend. It has no authority whatever, but that's where the name came from. We do, though, have the Greek translation of the Old Testament in several different forms. When those Jewish fathers came to the lid, the cover of the ark, they didn't translate it into Greek for a lid. They translated it into the Greek in Romans 3:26 that Paul used years later. It's pronounced hilasterion. If you want to write it out, it's Hilasterion, hilasterion. And that means a place or means of reconciliation. Sometimes translated mercy seat. See if you have a version at home that says mercy seat. Or it may have sacrifice of atonement or something like that. But the word is that lid. We still don't have mercy seat, though. Do you know who made up mercy seat? In the 1530s AD, in the Reformation, when Luther was translating, not from Hebrew into Greek, but Hebrew into German, he came to this word for the lid, the cover, and he sensed its importance, and he translated it into Old German Gnadstuhl, 2 words, lowercase G-N-A-D and then lowercase S-T-U-L. In modern German Bibles, it's 1 word, Gnadenstuhl, capital G. That's the seat or stool of mercy. Well, we still don't have it in English. Who did that? That was Tyndale. In the 1530s, he was working on the translation of the Old Testament, having finished the New. Much of this he did in prison. He was arrested, you know, strangled and burned to death because of what he did to help us read the Bible. And when he came to this word for the lid of the ark, he knew what Luther had done, and he translated mercy seat. That's the first time that piece of gold was called a mercy seat. I think the history adds something to this, because Paul's choice suggests his inspired understanding of what went on in that most holy place. When Jesus came, he came and died to become the mercy seat. So Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is the day of the lid, the day of the cover, the day of the place or means of reconciliation. And think what it adds in turn to the meaning of Christ's life and death, that Paul said by dying he became the mercy seat. So don't, when you get to heaven, go around asking what the mercy seat's all about, because you might have to define what that is. Although, of course, Moses, you know, has been up there watching, hasn't he? So maybe he's heard us call it the mercy seat since then. What are you going to do with the children, say? We're not going to tell them everything I've just said, surely. Shall we just say, God said to Moses, take the gold and make a mercy seat? And then explain later on?
New International, and it says make it a cover of atonement in Exodus
Yes.
25, and then in the verse you're translating,
Yes.
it says Christ made the atonement of a sacrifice, and then it has a footnote like he would make a reconciliation as if turning away wrath, but it uses the word atonement in both places.
I like everything they've said except the turning away wrath because of what it implies, but I think it's very helpful that they would show the connection. Don't you think so? That Moses, having other words he might have used, would choose the name of the lid, the covering of the ark. So I think that's a very useful translation. Now in Leviticus, the ark, the tabernacle, the furnishings are all completed and the sacrifices begin. And we have rules and regulations that were to be followed. But there are also rules and regulations regarding food. There's the list of clean and unclean meats, and you might want to discuss that. There seem to be regulations regarding hygiene, the treatment of people with certain diseases. There seems to be quite a lot of leprosy in those parts, although, have you ever read a book on medicine in the Bible? They're not sure that it was the leprosy that we know about. It seems that almost any dermatological disorder, skin disorder, was called leprosy. We don't have to work that out. The main thing is, what does it say about God that he would give them such rules and regulations to live by? And then there are regulations for Sabbath and for festivals. And also to keep peace in the camp, there's the rule, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Remember Leviticus 24:20. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And a lot of people prefer that to the rule about turning the other cheek. Because turning the other cheek just gets it hit too, doesn't it? Whereas an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth might restrain people a little more. And many of us are certainly counting on God to give the wicked an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth in the end, are we not? We call that justice. So you see, it isn't that we don't like that, we just don't like God to do it to us. But we certainly want him to do it to the wicked, or how do you feel about that? Then there's the story of Nadab and Abihu, who staggered drunk into the tabernacle with an incense of their own concoction, which demonstrated their irreverence and disdain for God. They were like the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, who were so irreverent. And God chose on that occasion to destroy them. Fire came forth from God and consumed them. Will remind us of other similar occasions in the Bible. And then in Leviticus 10:17, did you notice that the priests were getting into trouble for not eating the meat offering? They were burning it and they were supposed to eat it. How could you be a vegetarian if God says if you don't eat the meat, you get into trouble? Well, was vegetarianism an issue then? How are we to understand that? Taken out of its context, you know what can be done. Our Seventh-day Adventist Bible commentary is very helpful as far as the details are concerned. And it is very detailed. And I'd recommend that you might look in there. It's Volume 1, pages 698 to 710. And it's drawn from Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, very clearly laid out. I don't think we need to work on those details so much. Main question is, did Leviticus help enhance, clarify our picture of God? I mean, what is revealed about God in Leviticus? Or should we say, since the ceremonial system was done away with at the cross, we really are wasting time studying what was done away with. So I don't believe that's what Colossians 2:14 says, but if that's your understanding of Colossians 2:14, it would seem to be a waste of time, maybe just something of antiquarian interest, to study the old ceremonial system. Was it a bad system? Well, in Colossians 2:14, we read that Christ took this thing that was against us and contrary to us, and he nailed it to the cross. He took it out of the way. If it's that bad, should we even be reading it? Well, in Colossians 2:14, the Greek doesn't say that. It says the handwriting that was against us was nailed to the cross. And that word handwriting means an agreement. It means a sentence. It means a receipt. Well, we don't want to talk too much about Colossians in advance, but my conviction is that Colossians no way suggests that we're wasting our time studying this system. Who gave the system? Did he give us something bad? What was the purpose of the system? Well, how about Galatians 3, where Paul says, and they were accusing him of doing away with the system, weren't they? He said, why then the law? It was added because of transgression to protect us and to bring us to Christ. Do you think we would do well to study God's methods of protecting us and bringing us back to himself? That doesn't suggest that it's bad. In fact, don't we understand it as a symbolic representation of salvation by faith in the one to come and so on? Of course, maybe it's all those other rules and regulations that we want to get rid of, like clean and unclean meats. Well, let's deal with that in a moment. Maybe we should ask this question. This gift of God, this representation of the plan of salvation as we understand it on the authority of the New Testament, did it help the people very much? In the history of the Jews, do we find the ceremonial system was of great benefit? Did they all understand? Did many understand? Did some understand? Well, you read the prophets, and they obviously did. You read Psalm 51, that's coming up in a Sabbath school lesson shortly, and David says, I used to offer sacrifices for the wrong reason. I realize now if I sacrificed my own son, it wouldn't be appropriate. That isn't what you want. What you want is truth in the inner man. So give me a new heart and a right spirit. And then he didn't say, I'm not going to offer sacrifices anymore. Now that I understand, he says, now I'll go on offering those sacrifices, but for the right reason. Now, what is the right reason? What was the wrong reason? Well, I wish we had time. We could go into the prophets yet to come. Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea and Amos and Micah, they all talk about the wrong use of the sacrifices. Well, come down to Christ's day. You remember he went into not the tabernacle now, but the temple. And what were they doing? But selling sacrificial material. And he said, take these things hence, make not my Father's house an emporium, is the Greek word. That's the name of the store on Market Street in San Francisco. I mean, it's a place where business is done. They were very jealous of the precincts of the sanctuary, but it didn't inhibit them from doing business there. But more than that, to show how these rules and regulations were misunderstood. And this is certainly not to put our Jewish friends in a bad light. You know, when we put them in a bad light, we're putting ourselves in a bad light because we do the same things, it seems to me. So I hope they would realize that. But as the Jews looked at the rules in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they found that the blueprint was still not sufficiently detailed. There were still questions that could be raised. Now, you couldn't pick up sticks on Sabbath. You shouldn't pick up manna on Sabbath. Besides, it didn't fall then anyway, did it? You shouldn't light a fire on the Sabbath. In the wilderness, that is. They were allowed to light fires when they got to Palestine. So the question was raised, how can we be sure we always do the right thing, since all kinds of activities are not specified in these books? So the well-meaning fathers of Judaism began to list the rules, and you can find these published in various collections. One is called the Mishnah. This is an English language translation by Oxford University, and you should read through here to see how the concern to obey the rules in these books that we're reading right now was extended to cover everything you could possibly think of doing. For example, the section on Sabbath observance. Wouldn't that be a matter of very great concern? It is to us, isn't it? Well, you read in here about the commandment, thou shalt not do any work on the Sabbath. Next question, what is work? Well, you know, even our wives sometimes have had babies on Sabbath, and for that they labored on the Sabbath day, did they not? Now, if that seems ridiculous to you, you want to read the rules. Well, look how the pastor of this church works on Sabbath. He probably works harder on Sabbath than any other day. Is he violating the spirit of the day? What if it's your turn to be on duty in a hospital nearby? Maybe the staff is a little shorter on Sabbath and you work extra hard. Well, they worried about this. And so they finally worked this out. The main classes of work are 40, save one. And here are the classes of work: sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, cleansing crops, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, washing or beating or dyeing it, spinning, weaving, making 2 loops, weaving 2 threads, separating 2 threads, tying a knot, loosening a knot, sewing 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew 2 stitches, hunting a gazelle, slaughtering or flaying or salting it or curing its skin, scraping it or cutting it up, writing 2 letters, erasing in order to write 2 letters, building, pulling down, putting out a fire, lighting a fire, striking with a hammer, and taking out aught from one domain into another. These are the main classes of work, 40 save one. Now, that's just the beginning. Here come the details on these matters. Haven't you often wished for a blueprint that would tell you whether you could do this or that on the Sabbath? Our Jewish friends have rule books that tell them, and they claim the authority of the Old Testament books, the Pentateuch. He is guilty or culpable that writes 2 letters, whether on the Sabbath, of course, whether with his right hand or with his left, whether the same or different letters, whether in different inks or in any language. And it goes on in some detail. Well, here's another one. If a person's teeth pain him on the Sabbath, he may not suck vinegar through them, but he may take vinegar after his usual fashion, and he's lucky if he does take vinegar normally, because that will help his teeth. And if he is healed, he is healed. And then it talks about what you should do about putting medicine on other parts of the body that might hurt. You see, when Jesus spat on the ground on Sabbath and made clay out of the spittle and put medicine on the man's eyes, he was in trouble. He might as well have brought a cement mixer and mixed a great deal more. Well, reading on. By the way, once again, I would say this is not to make light of our Jewish friends. Do you know Adventists who do similar things? Well, if a Gentile should come to put out your fire, you may not say to him, put it out, or do not put it out. But if he volunteers to do it on his own, that's all right, for keeping Sabbath is his own business. Now, if a man bathed in the water of a cave or in the water of Tiberias and dried himself, even though it was with 10 towels, he may not bring them away in his hand. But if 10 men dried themselves with 1 towel, wiping their faces, their hands, and their feet, they may bring the towel away in their hands. You say, that puzzles me. Well, there's a footnote that explains. You see, the sin would be squeezing the water out of the towel. And then here's the thing I think I told you about. If you're traveling on Friday with a donkey heavily laden and the sun goes down, what should you do? The rule is here. And many, many others like it. That's a thick book, and that's only part of the rules. Well, this week I received something from Saudi Arabia that reminds us, did I show you last week? That devout descendants of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar are still doing these exact same things. You see, the Arabs are descended from Hagar, are they not? And Ishmael. And the Jews are descended from Sarah, and they're all descended from Abraham. The other day I saw on Channel 2 News a picture of some Jews stoning other Jews for Sabbath violation. The ones who were stoning were the very, very conscientious, devout Jews called the Hasidim. They're the ones with the little ringlets on either side and the special hats and the long black clothes. I mean, they're absolutely dedicated to doing everything they should. Well, they were watching other Jews doing things on the Sabbath of which they did not approve. So they picked up stones and stoned them, and there they were on Channel 2, stoning fellow Jews for Sabbath violation. So you see, they are still very, very careful. But how about the Arabs descended from Hagar and Ishmael? Do you remember that new non-sexist version I referred to, which says, Abraham is our father, and Sarah and Hagar are our mother? Well, here is the Arab News, September 2, 1983. Dr. Wareham, leader of the open heart surgery team, he's over there, and he sent this to me. This is fortunately from the English language, Arab News. And on this page are many, many questions about how to conduct yourself when you take the pilgrimage to Mecca, and also how you should behave when worshiping and when praying. I'll just mention two. Here's a section entitled, Answering the Door When Praying. Question, is it permissible to stop my prayer to open the door or answer the telephone if someone knocks at the door or the telephone rings when I am praying, if there is no one else in the house? Answer. And answers are always given with authority because the one answering looked up the book, looked up the record. It's all spelled out. If you are engaged in an act of worship, you must not stop it for any reason. Allah says, do not abrogate your actions. That's the key text. What you can do, however, is to move toward the door if the distance does not exceed 2 steps. You must remember about 2 letters, 1 letter. The rules are very, very similar. These are cousins, you know. Cousins often hate each other. And that the tension over there, it goes way back to those old days. All right? You must not turn your face away from the direction of Mecca. If you make 3 steps, you have rendered your prayers invalid. Alternatively, you may say, and here's an Arab word, you may say this word loudly, and it's a word of worship to God, having the intention of remembering Allah and alerting the caller to the fact that you are praying. Obviously, you should not attempt that if you are in doubt whether the caller will hear you. So you see, you must not talk to him out there and say, I cannot talk to you, I'm praying, but you may raise your voice in prayer, and you may utter a word of praise to God, which you would have uttered anyway, so that perhaps he will hear it and cease knocking on the door until you're through. You see, you want him to realize, but you may not let him know. Like the man with the donkey, the Gentile may remove the load, but you must not indicate in any way that your donkey needs the load removed. And if the Gentile should volunteer, you heave a sigh of relief. But then you worry, did I in any way indicate that my donkey needed help? Then you've broken the Sabbath. Can you see how you'd be worried all the time whether you'd broken the Sabbath or not? You never could be sure. Well, here's what to do when the telephone rings. In the case of the telephone call, I suggest that you can pick up the receiver and hold it close to your mouth to make the person at the other end hear that you are praying. You must not go out of your way to indicate that to the caller. So here you've picked up the receiver and you want him to know you're praying, but you must not do anything to indicate that you're praying, but you may pick up the receiver and pray into the receiver. There's a fine distinction there. You must not say anything which is not part of what you say in your prayers. If you do, your prayers are invalid. Then wouldn't you be worried all the time? Jesus said you put burdens on people that are heavy to bear, and they're still doing it in that part of the world. So when you read these books in the Old Testament, remember there are millions of people who still follow these rules, except they've spelled them out in even greater detail. Now, what are they supposed to do to us? Or should we write them off as the law of Moses? Don't we often say that? They have less authority because they're the law of Moses and they were written by hand and put in the side of the ark. But did you notice Leviticus 27:34, which says, these are the commandments God gave to Moses. So they are God's law given to Moses. Besides, if you add to Leviticus 27:34, 1 Corinthians 10:4, it says the one who led Israel through the wilderness was Christ. So, gentle Jesus is the one who gave them this whole system. The one who sees the little sparrow fall told them to kill the animals and offer them in sacrifice. So now, what does the whole system tell us about God? Whether the building or the priesthood the priesthood. What labeled you as eligible to serve as a priest? Was it not your heredity? So you were descended, you see. That builds up a hierarchy, doesn't it? In fact, could you be quite wicked and be a priest? How about the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas? They were so wicked, as you remember, they were assaulting the women when they came to worship, and yet they were still priests because they had the right genealogy, the right lineage. Isn't it significant that the New Testament talks about Melchizedek, the king of righteousness and the king of peace, and he had no genealogy, without father or mother. He was priest because he was the king of righteousness and the king of peace, and we may be priests after that order and not because of our lineage. Well, what was your reaction reading this week the book of Leviticus? The sacrifices, the priesthood, all the blood that was shed. How did you react to it? Is it one of the clearer books in the Bible? God has been accused of being arbitrary, exacting, vengeful, unforgiving, and severe. How about exacting? Did they have to build that tabernacle precisely right? Did they have to follow the services precisely right? When Nadab and Abihu did not follow precisely the rules for mixing the incense, look what happened to them. Is that exacting? So what are we to do with this?
Well, in the first 3 chapters, I found 6 times a certain phrase mentioned, a pleasing odor to the Lord.
Yes, a pleasing odor to the Lord. Go on, what about that?
How do we consider that?
You could see how we could understand that when the smell of the meat arose, I don't know how it gets out through space, but God was saying, that smells good. I'll bless those people. Well, isn't that what it seems to say? How are we to understand that? Well, what procedure should we follow when we read passages like that? Of course, the safest thing is to read on. And you come to places where God says, I have no delight in your sacrifices. In fact, I have no delight in your worship at all. I can't even stand the way you sing. In Amos, God says, I cannot stand the sound of your noisy hymns. And in Isaiah, God says, and I cannot stand the way you pray. Though you make many prayers, I will not listen. And your attendance in church, God says, who requires this trampling of my courts? Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Now come and let us reason together. So the prophets had a lot of things to say about these sacrifices. And then especially where David says it isn't sacrifice you desire at all. Do you think God would, the one who sees the sparrow fall, would smell 2 pigeons burning and say, that's delicious. I will indeed bless those people. So what would this mean? How did you handle it? Because you undoubtedly thought that through.
I'm afraid I didn't. I just kept underlining it.
Do you want to put some other things with it, maybe, so we can handle the whole thing at one time? What other things should we put with that to compare?
I think one of the main things is obedience.
Yes.
Perhaps God was very much pleased with the following of the command. Perhaps many times we as Seventh-day Adventists have a problem with Sabbath keeping, as you were saying before. We want approval from the pastor when we want to do something. Is it okay to do on the Sabbath? And perhaps in this case, God is pleased with their following the rules, whatever they are. We don't like rules. We have a problem with it.
Well, now, let me just question that. Did God give them some things to do which don't make any sense? But he would say, if you do them, I'm pleased that you're obeying me. We still have the question, why would he ask them to do these things? It's true. What you say is absolutely true. We could talk about Cain and Abel in this connection, couldn't we? God told them to kill the lamb. And Cain thought, I think God would enjoy some fruit. You know, a vegetarian God, some lovely fruit. And I'm very grateful. And he brought the fruit. And Abel killed the lamb. With which sacrifice was God pleased? That was pretty apparent. In fact, it displeased Cain, did it not? Now, why would it please God that Abel would do something, well, it's cruelty to animals, and the blood flowed. Some lovely fruit. Wouldn't that be much nicer? Imagine what fruit they had those days. Cain's altar must have looked gorgeous, with all the beautiful fruit stacked up there, and over here's a poor dead lamb bleeding and being burned. And God would say, I'm pleased with that one. Now, you mentioned obedience would be part of it. Would he want more? How much does God want us to understand what we're doing when we obey?
Sacrificial system.
Yes.
Pointed to the coming of the Son of God. It was to be a reminder. The cleansing or the remission of sins through the shedding of blood was another reminder.
Now, supposing we look at the sacrifice and we assume that we're offering sacrifice to please God, to propitiate him, to assuage his wrath, and to win his favor. And if you bring a really good sacrifice, I mean, if one's good, why not a dozen? You know, and you really offer a big sacrifice, and God says, that's good, and I'll bless you. What road are we going down? Would God be pleased with that kind of a sacrifice?
Because he says, I'm not pleased with your sacrifices. But I think at the time, at the end, before Christ came, that's exactly what happened.
Yes.
The sacrifice in themselves became meaningless, and it was an involvement with the self. And again, we have that whole thing tied together.
Yes.
It was the removal of the self and allowing God to work through.
So he would only be pleased if we offered the sacrifice for the right reason.
It's like, how do I keep the Sabbath?
If it's for the wrong reason, it actually would support Satan's charges, and that's true with Sabbath keeping and everything else, is it not? Now, the prophets really dealt with this time after time, and one of the clearest places is Micah 6:6. Take a look at that again, where the prophet in behalf of the people is acknowledging his sinfulness and their sinfulness, and that we need to come back to God. And he raises a question in Micah 6:6, with what shall I come before the Lord? I want to come back as a repentant sinner. With what shall I come and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings? Well, it says we should, doesn't it? With calves a year old. Will the Lord be pleased? Now he smelled the sweet savor and was pleased. Will the Lord be pleased with not one ram, but thousands of rams? I mean, if one moves him, how about 1,000? Would he be pleased with 10,000s of rivers of oil? You can see the point he's making dramatically. I mean, if he likes a little oil, why not 10,000, not bottles, but rivers of oil? Shall I even give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? And the answer is, he has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you when you come before him? But to do justice, to do what's right, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And if you come with a sacrifice in some other state of mind, that doesn't please him at all. If you come with the blood of Christ in order to please God, how about that mistake? Well, does it please God when we come with an understanding of why Jesus had to die? Yes, if that wins us back to humility and trust and a willingness to listen and a desire to behave as he did, make a long list. If the death of Christ is rightly understood, that pleases God because he's going to save another child. But if we come with the wrong understanding, that wouldn't please him. He's going to lose another child. And this is argued, isn't it, all through the Old Testament, the right and the wrong way to follow these rules and regulations. Is it possible to follow the blueprint scrupulously and be absolutely unsavable and no friend of God? Look at the people who crucified Christ and then ran home to go on keeping the blueprint, as it's never been kept before. So this is really present truth for us because we know we're near the end, and we know how God's people are described in the end, and we want to be people who keep the commandments of God. But if we keep them for the wrong reason, this doesn't please God, because he'll lose us. We will become his enemies even as we seek to obey him. So we need to watch very carefully if there arises among us a great concern to straighten out our lives and follow the blueprint. How could you fault that? It's just if we do it in the wrong way because we're motivated by the wrong understanding, we could become enemies too. And when Christ comes the second time, we will not recognize him any more than he was recognized in the first century. So I think to study what happens here in these early books is very relevant and timely. God gave all of this, didn't he? And Paul says, I thank God for this whole system. We needed it. It was added as an emergency measure to help us. He says, does faith do away with law? God forbid. Faith establishes law by putting it in its proper perspective. What perspective? It was added to bring us to Christ. How could you fault a system that God has given to bring us to Christ? And many Jews understood correctly. They're the ones we read in the prophets, aren't they? Moses didn't misunderstand. The people who understood this system the clearest were some of those who offered the very sacrifices. So some understood and some didn't. How about now? Some keep the Sabbath for the right reason and some for the wrong reason. Some of us are God's friends and some are not. And some of us will hear the words, go away, I never knew you, which means we never were friends. So we can see ourselves back in these ancient times, and it's really worth looking at each of these details.
Their problem was the same as Paul was talking about in the Lord's Supper, that they did not perceive Christ. They didn't see him in the sacrifice. As many today take the Lord's Supper as a sacrament, something by in and of itself it's going to save them, whereas it's the attitude toward Christ, past, present, and future, that makes it possible.
Oh, what do you think of that comment? I like that very much indeed. Did not Paul say some participate in the Lord's Supper unworthily? They eat and drink unworthily because they do not perceive the significance of it. They think of it as a sacrament maybe, and maybe it pleases God that we do it. I don't want to make light of my grandmother. She was very old and feeble when I saw her do this. But when I was a boy in England, I hadn't been baptized yet, and I'd watched the older folk participate, And it being 12 o'clock, especially if the pastor had talked too long, I was starving. And here came these little pieces of things. It wasn't much. The rest got to eat and drink, and I got nothing. A very difficult time for children. But my grandma would be so careful with the little glass to drink all of it, because the scripture says, drink ye all of it. And she drank every little bit. Well, I'm not going to say she ate and drank unworthily. This was when she was very old. What does that mean, though? If you don't drain that little glass, are you in trouble? When you set it back in the little socket, sometimes it drains down the sides and there's a little bit of purple color in the bottom. You're in trouble. But we're not going to lick it out, are we? What are we going to do? Well, look it up. It doesn't say that. In fact, if you're worried about that, you're really not participating in its meaning. Because the meaning of drink ye all of it is beautiful. Yes, it's all of you drink it. We have open communion, don't we? All of you participate, including you, Judas, who's about to betray me. All of you drink it. Now, that speaks well of God, doesn't it? How many feet did he wash? Good feet, skip the bad ones? He washed the feet of his betrayer the night before he died and said something about himself. So I love that phrase, rightly understood. It's generous, isn't it? All of you drink of it. I think that the communion could be even a burden to us and no blessing at all if we do it for the wrong reason. So Paul says, discern the meaning of it, or you're eating and drinking unworthily.
Some people even take that all and
Yes.
betray it by saying that everybody has to drink out of the same glass.
Oh, that's right.
So
The common cup is passed in some places. Well, so long as they do it in the right spirit, it would be all right, if not entirely hygienic. And maybe some rules in Leviticus would have discouraged the common cup, as you recall.
I think of the words of the prophet Samuel. To obey is better than sacrifice. To
Yes.
hearken than the fat of rams.
See how early that is that he was able to say that in the Old Testament. Isn't that what the later prophets say, and Jesus says, and James says, and Paul says? Absolutely. By the way, the word obedience, again, it's good to be reminded of this. To obey is better than sacrifice. Well, how perfectly do you have to obey? Is any one of us capable of performing perfectly, even at our very best? So I love to realize that the word obedience in the Greek is traceable to root words that mean a humble willingness to listen. The equivalent of walking humbly before your God in Micah 6:6. Now, can God ask? Now, our performance may not be perfect, to be sure, but the willingness to listen, can it be without reservation? Can it be wholehearted? Now, that kind of obedience is what God wants. That word for obedience is even used for a doorkeeper. He's the one who listens, you see, at the door. So the doorkeeper is called the obedient one, the one who listens. Now, if the master comes and knocks on the door and you say, well, I hear you, but I haven't finished the morning paper, come back in 15 minutes, you would not be employed very long. So the willingness to listen implied, of course, a willingness to go ahead and do the best you could. You might find the door is stuck, and you can't get it open, you're too weak. But you're willing to do it, and the master says, let me help you open the door. But we have so often stressed the perfection of the performance. Which of us can do it? And then we say, well, I never can perform perfectly, so I guess there's no kind of perfection possible. God says, yes, give me your heart where a man does his thinking, and I want that to be without reservation. You are really committed to a willingness to listen, to walk humbly with your God. That's not asking too much, is it? And God says, your willingness to listen to me is worth more than all the sacrifices. In fact, if the sacrifice of my son does not win you to a willingness to listen and walk humbly before me, it has done you no good at all. And I find that consistently through Scripture. Isn't it good that Samuel that early would say it? It's always been true in the Bible. You don't have to come to Hebrews to get that. You read it in the Old Testament.
As I read Leviticus, I became concerned about the priest and all of his mathematics and how he had to figure out how many 7 this time and 6 that time and 2 this time. And I wondered if God was really trying to make mathematicians out of the priests. And then I was drawn to what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 14:40, which says, let all things be done decently and in order. Yeah. And wasn't God really trying to tell Israel that he was an abiding presence, that he was their Savior, and he was demonstrating his character. And his character is one of order.
Let's pursue that. I like so much that so many of you use the whole Bible when you approach one of these things. Don't you think those words in Corinthians, let everything be done decently and in order? I think that's highly relevant to the way the services were set up. First of all, on the matter of the numbers, is it not true that God would have preferred that they have a very simple system? But rules were added and ceremonies added and added some more because they needed them, and that's Paul's comment. The law was added. Well, Ellen White's comment on this in Patriarchs and Prophets 364 is so eloquent, and just to read a little bit of it, she says, if man had kept the law of God as given to Adam after his fall. Now that was a simple service there, wasn't it? Preserved by Noah. Remember the services he performed when he came out of the ark? Were there not 7 clean beasts? And you ever wonder why 7 an odd number and 2 unclean? He sacrificed one of the clean ones, did he not? All right? But it was relatively simple and observed by Abraham. Did Abraham have a complicated system? There would have been no necessity for the ordinance of circumcision, she even says. Now, why did God give them the ordinance of circumcision? I mean, that's a strange thing to do. It had nothing to do with hygiene those days. Circumcision now is a medical matter. But in those days, it was a ceremonial matter. Why do you think he gave them? Something that later on New Testament writers would discourage. Remember what Paul said about it? He said, you want your heart circumcised, not your body. And yet God gave them the rite of circumcision. Remember how ceremonially it was done with Abraham and on other occasions when they forgot to do it for a while. And yet then later God says, I don't like you doing this because you misunderstand. Then why did he give it to them at all? It's interesting to think about. And somewhere along in our discussion, we should think about possible reasons as a test of our ability to recreate the historical setting within which he chose this of all things. But not to distract from this paragraph. And if the descendants of Abraham had kept the covenant of which circumcision was a sign, they would never have been seduced into idolatry. And I think the words are carefully chosen. Seduced into idolatry. The seduction of idolatry was quite literal. Immorality was consecrated as part of religious worship. And the Old Testament, as I mentioned before, don't want to mention it too often, but it is a very important part of the scene in those days. The consecration of immorality in God's name. And the Jews found this, many of them, irresistible, didn't they? It's mentioned in the record over and over. Well, had they not forgotten what circumcision stood for, they would not have been seduced. And I've even wondered if somewhat literally God chose this to help them. Every rule God gives us is to help us. It's too bad we need them. You know, the Jews were forever going to look at those heathen rites. Hosea says they'd go up into the mountains to the groves where the shade was good, and they'd watch the worship of fertility. And sometimes they couldn't resist, and they joined in. And Satan's masterpiece there was to pervert this marvelous sharing of God's creative power with us, which speaks so well of our God, into grossest indulgence, and then defend it in the name of religion. And so when you went to those services in the worship of fertility, and the worship of Baal and Ashtaroth was that. Baal was the male and Ashtaroth was the female. When you went there, you were offered a marvelous experience with your God. You could even come preciously near and dear to your Lord in a very real way. Sometimes, and it's almost too gross to describe. We have some books that picture this at Loma Linda, and I do believe they're in a locked case of all things, even in a medical center. They are among the most horrible things you ever saw, where people would actually have some kind of a relationship with the idol. Gross. But another way of doing this was to have dedicated women who would serve not as Bible instructors, but as cult prostitutes. And in God's name, you'd have this experience, and you knew you'd been to church those days. And you'd come away and say, I had a marvelous experience. My heart was strangely warmed. And also you were filled with the Spirit during the service, except you got it out of a goat skin. And when you were filled with the Spirit, you experienced love and joy and peace and even spoke in tongues. Have you ever heard drunks do it? And so when they came home from service, they had a marvelous time. And then they came to the Adventist church, and everybody sat there bolt upright waiting for the period to end, you know. And it seemed so dull to come to the ordinary services where everything was done decently and in order, which suggests that our services shouldn't be so dull as to lead people into temptation. So they'd lift their eyes onto the hills and follow them up into the mountains, and they'd sacrifice with the cult prostitutes. That's the book of Hosea. Well, can you imagine an Israeli young man up there? And he's been seduced into this thing. And at the last minute, the cult prostitute says, I see you are a Jew. Because they could tell. And by the way, they used to look to see those days. You remember in Galatians, Paul brought in a fellow believer who had not been circumcised, and he said spies came in secretly to find out if he was or not. Would you like to join a committee appointed by the pastor to discover if somebody qualified? You see, they did it. The Bible says they did it. Well, this cult prostitute could say, oh, maybe you shouldn't imagine yourself doing it. I have. I mean, imagine you're there, and at that last moment, before all is lost, she says, I see you are a Jew. And you'd say, you're right, I am. How can I do this thing? And maybe you'd put your clothes back on and go home. Are there not many rules in the Bible designed to help us? Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk was probably given to discourage them from doing something that reminded them of the worship of fertility up in the mountains, because it's been found in the records of Canaanite worship. In the worship of fertility, they boiled a kid in its mother's milk. So God gave us things to help. Now, if we had had a right relationship with God, there'd have been no need for this kind of help, because we'd never go up in the mountains and never be seduced by the Moabite women. You remember in the days of Balaam? Well, that's next week. Balaam did not succeed in cursing them, but you remember what King Balak did? He sent in these women who were used to this kind of thing. Promiscuity was nothing. They even did it in God's name. And they almost overcame the Jews. So God gave them something to help them. But it says here that had they not forgotten what circumcision stood for, they would never have been seduced into idolatry, nor would it have been necessary for them to suffer a life of bondage in Egypt. Even that was not necessary. They would have kept God's law in mind, and there would have been no necessity for it to be proclaimed from Sinai or engraved upon the tables of stone. That's an emergency measure. And had the people practiced the principles of the Ten Commandments, there would have been no need of the additional directions given to Moses. And it gets pretty complicated after a while. God did not want to make it that complicated. As you mentioned, it was supposed to be simple, but immensely significant and deeply moving. Hopefully, every time they killed the lamb, it would do what Hebrews says it's supposed to do. Do you remember the verse in Hebrews which says every time they sacrificed, they experienced a reminder of sin? Hebrews 10:3. That's what the sacrifices were for. They were a continual reminder of sin, and that the wages of sin is death. But it also was a reminder of the promise that God gave to Adam and Eve. I will send someone, an innocent person, to solve this problem. Unfortunately, we've forgotten the meaning of the sacrifices. We've come to think they please God in and of themselves, that even the death of Christ is to propitiate God's anger and assuage his wrath and win his favor, who was in Christ reconciling the world unto himself, who sacrificed himself in the Son. Who so loved the world that he gave his only Son. It's a dreadful thing to treat the sacrifice of Christ as if it was the sacrifice of an animal. It's just the blood was more precious. But that's what most folk in the world who call themselves Christians are inclined to see in the death of Christ. But it's much more than that, isn't it? Much more significant. We should come to that later. But what I like in your comment here is Paul's comment that everything should be done decently and in order. In the sacrificial system and all those other services, were things done decently and in order? In fact, it almost seemed to be overemphasized. What was the religion like all around them? Now, God gave them priests, nothing unusual about that. But how were the priests dressed? Did they look like the kind of people who would run a religion where immorality was consecrated as part of religious worship? Did God even say, you priests must dress so modestly that when you climb the steps, your nakedness does not appear? You remember? In the record, they were to be modest. Modesty had nothing to do with the worship of fertility. What about being sober and clear of mind when you served as a priest? Was that not definitely required? Nadab and Abihu staggered in precisely the condition the worshippers in those heathen religions were, filled with the Spirit, but the wrong kind. You don't do that in the tabernacle. God said everything here must be done decently and in order. And isn't it true the whole thing is a model of that, of purity, modesty, decency, order? The whole thing is. I think that really says something about our God. And God says, I'm sorry I had to do all this because I love pigeons and I love lambs and I wish you didn't have to do all of this. But it's an emergency measure. I love my son and don't want him to die either. But he will one of these days. These are emergency measures not to be misunderstood. Would it then be that the overwhelming detail, which sometimes might even bore us as we read this, well, it is an overwhelming demonstration of the way God wishes to be worshipped. Does he want people gyrating around in front of him, babbling in some unknown tongue? Or does he want our clearest thoughts for our infinitely intelligent God? And I think the tabernacle fits in beautifully then with what Paul said about Corinthians. In Corinth, they were getting drunk at the Lord's Supper. Isn't that what it says? They were also practicing immorality, he says, even worse than the heathen. And they were babbling in a tongue that nobody could understand. That's what was going on around the Christian world, still in the mystery religions. And Paul says, remember, God has made it plain all along, he being the kind of person he is. The only way to approach him is decently and in order. So don't you think it all fits together through the scriptures? So that was impressive, surely, to the Jews. But what do you think, though, about a little building with little compartments and little pieces of furniture, and some folk get so caught up in the furnishings and the draperies that they forget the meaning and significance of it? Was it not a hazard to give them that whole system? Was it not misunderstood and largely abused? What do you think of a God who would choose to give this to his people, knowing it would be so misunderstood? When he could have said, let me make it plain, gather at the foot of the mountain, and please be quiet. No, first he had to shake the ground under their feet before they'd be quiet. They didn't know about decently and in order, which immediately suggests that what I'm about to suggest doesn't make any sense. They were hard of hearing, those people at the foot of the mountain. So God did not come down on the mountain and say, blessed are the meek. They despised meek people. That's why when Moses said, I'm the meekest of all men, he wasn't bragging. He used to bother me as a boy. Look at him bragging about being so good. No, he was saying, I know you don't respect this, but I'm not ashamed to be the meekest of all men. They didn't have respect for that. In fact, who does now? And then he said, God will raise up a prophet like me. And he was gentle Jesus, meek and mild. The meekest person we've ever seen. Was it weakness? Or trying to say something about God? So now God has an audience who will not respond favorably to blessed are the meek. When he stood on the mount and said, blessed are the meek, was it very well received? When he said, blessed are the poor, or the poor in spirit, meaning those who recognize their spiritual need, was that well received? Well, how about pray for your enemies? How were they going to overcome the Romans if you pray for your enemies? They didn't like this. And so Jesus had to pause in the middle of his presentation and say, think not I've come to destroy the Old Testament, the law and the prophets. I've not come to destroy it. I've come to fulfill it, to explain it, and tell you what it's all about. I happen to be the one who thundered on Sinai, and you're never going to hear me thunder these 3.5 years. The closest he came was the cleansing of the sanctuary, but he evidently didn't thunder because the children weren't scared. And so they should have asked Jesus, well, if you're the same one, why did you thunder on Sinai? And he'd say, well, take a look at the audience. Look how they were behaving. They didn't respect me. Even though they'd experienced the 10 plagues, had observed the 10 plagues, which had even moved Pharaoh for 3 days, the Israelites themselves were not very much impressed with God, were they? And so he had to do it over, thunder and lightning and an earthquake. And he did move them for a while, and like Pharaoh, they said, yes, all that the Lord hath said we will do. You remember? And 40 days later, how impressed were they? Dancing in a fertility cult rite, drunk and naked around a golden calf, and the calf was a symbol of fertility. Now, what do you do with people who've witnessed the 10 plagues of Egypt? They've witnessed the thunders of Sinai. They've seen the 10 commandments brought down and Moses' face shining so brightly. They've seen the Red Sea miracle and the wonders that followed, and they still are not respectful. What do you do? Well, one option is for God to say to the angels, is it all right with you if I quit? I'll save Moses, he's my friend, but I don't see many more. And Ellen White indicates the angels were with God and said, why don't you quit? And God said, I'm not nearly through yet. So I'm going to start by gathering Israel around the sandbox. They're not ready for the Sermon on the Mount. They're certainly not ready for Romans and Galatians and Hebrews. He gathers them around the sandbox, and he gives them a cute little building. And it was cute. Little compartments and little furniture in there. It wasn't very big. And he gave them all these services. He had priests dressed up. If Elder Stutler comes next Sabbath dressed like that, you're going to wonder if the pressure's getting to him these days, and he wants to exercise his authority. That's the way the ministers looked those days. What do you think of a God who would take his children to the sandbox Isn't that a good teacher? Isn't that the way to go? And some understood. And as they understood, they wished to learn more and more and even come to the place where they wouldn't need the sandbox anymore, because now they'd realize this represents what's going on in the heart of the universe on a much larger scale. But Israel, once they were introduced to the sandbox, they liked to camp there. And God finally said, you've camped here at the foot of this mountain long enough. It's time to move on. And to this day, it seems to me that many of us prefer the sandbox. We even hold large meetings to discuss where the work in heaven is being conducted, this room or that. I say that's sandbox. And I think we should move on from the mountain. Well, no. You see, these illustrations, they only go so far. We should go on from Sinai to Canaan, that's true. But do you know on the side of that mountain, traditionally, is the cave where Elijah learned what God really wants. You remember Elijah was a man of wind, earthquake, and fire. That moved him greatly. But finally, God came to him as the still small voice. And Elijah was not afraid, but he covered his head in deepest reverence. He now had learned that the Infinite One prefers to talk softly and quietly and appeal to our reason and our good sense. And that cave is supposed to be on the side of the same mountain. At least it's right nearby, which says to me that the same God who thundered to get attention and used all these other methods to make it interesting for them and encourage them to be reverent and do things decently and in order, in the very same place when he had a friend who was willing to listen, said, really, I don't want all those things. What I want is that you be willing to listen. And then I can talk softly as a man speaks to his friend. Now, we know that with Elijah, and he was translated soon thereafter, wasn't he? Was there anybody in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy who knew what Elijah learned later at the mouth of the cave? Did God even those days have a friend who was used by God to build the sandbox and build the little cardboard buildings and the little cardboard priests? Was there someone who knew why God was doing it? That's what's so magnificent. Moses stood at the foot of Sinai and said, there is no need to be afraid. He knew why God was doing this. A consummately skillful teacher and father of us all. He always meets us where we are and speaks a language we can understand and leads us no faster than we're able to follow. And if we need sandbox, we will get sandbox, and we thank God for it. Paul says, I thank God for the sandbox. But it was to bring us to something far bigger. And some of you are still sitting at the sandbox. Weren't there not many of the Jews doing that? They wanted to go on with those things. He said we should go on to a much larger understanding, like Moses had, right there when he helped the people build those things. Why, Moses knew the truth about God. He could talk to him face to face as a man speaks to his friend. Even reason with God about God's reputation those days. Now that's coming up shortly, and we need to really observe this in the remaining books in the Pentateuch. God had in the midst of those emergency measures a man who didn't need the emergency measures. And if you want a real parallel to this, in the book of John, way down the line, Jesus says to the 12, up to this time I've talked to you in figures and symbols and metaphors and figures of speech, you remember? He's done it all through the Bible. Thank God that he did it. He said, the time has come for me to talk to you plainly about my Father. And that should remind us of Moses, who was instrumental in giving the people those figures and symbols. But it says in the book of Numbers, next time, God says, I don't talk to Moses that way. I talk to him plainly and clearly, face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. In other words, God has always wanted to speak to us directly like that, as a man speaks to his friend. But if we need people in between, like priests, if we need ceremonies and ritual and detailed rules and regulations, God, our gracious God, will give us those things. If we need thunder and lightning and she-bears to be reverent, he will send them. Do you like a God who'd do that? The only alternative If we need she-bears, we're just about gone. So if God does not send she-bears, we're through. We're not listening at all. So God sent she-bears, and some were warned and went back and listened to God. The thunder certainly led the people to be quiet and to listen. The sandbox has been a great blessing to us, but let's not camp around the sandbox. Let us go on to the real meaning, which is, how does God conduct the business of the universe at headquarters? The war in the family began in headquarters, didn't it? In fact, if you have 2 rooms up in heaven, in which of the 2 rooms in the heavenly sanctuary did the war begin? The holy or the most holy? In the most holy, right in the presence of God. And God has conducted his side of the war from that place. And that's where the war will end. And that's where peace will be restored, to spread out through the whole family. And another word for peace is at-one-ment, or atonement, or reconciliation. And where is the place or means of reconciliation? It's right where the war started. And it gives us a magnificent picture, I think. So Leviticus read this way is not a boring list of tiny details. I think it's God doing something most appropriate for the people at that time to distinguish their worship and their picture of God from that of the heathen around. You think there were cult prostitutes in the earthly tabernacle? That's why when Hophni and Phinehas did that dreadful thing, it was so offensive and so gross. All that Hophni and Phinehas were doing, they were doing what was done in the heathen religions around. Isn't it they'd invented something? But that's how dangerous it was. Who do you suppose thought that up and wanted it in the tabernacle of God's own people? So God had to act very forthrightly and decisively to clean that up. And you remember how he did it? Well, that's coming up in Samuel, isn't it? A little later on, and in Kings. Well, in summation, what do you think of God using this method? I think what we see is a teacher doing his work with infinite skill. And he knew what they needed, and he gave it to them. And we admire God for that. And it does suggest that if we become more and more like him, we too will sense what people need. And when we go out to the world, maybe some need thunder, and some are ready for the still small voice. Don't whisper softly to everybody, and don't thunder to everybody either. And some may need the sandbox pictures, and some may be ready for the larger view. Well, hopefully we will have the understanding and the tact and the willingness to listen, so that the God of infinite versatility may help us to be more versatile and meet people where they are. We can't go from door to door with a canned message. The people inside may not be appropriately communicated with that. The only real witness is the one who knows the truth himself so well that when he meets the person at the door, he can adapt his message. At least that's the godlike way, and none of us does it perfectly. That's why we're all needed. Only God can do that perfectly. But if we crave the ability to become more and more like him in this respect, it seems to me we're craving the thing that would enable our church to take the gospel to all the world. Right now, we don't know how to communicate with large sections of the human race, and we've got to find new ways and new methods. It is godlike to be versatile and understand what people need. But also, we need to realize that God doesn't want to use these emergency measures any longer than he has to. The ultimate goal is that he be able to talk to us plainly and clearly as a man speaks to his friend. Has he ever had any friends like that to encourage us? Moses, the one who wrote all of this down, is so described, and so is Abraham and Job, and maybe we could nominate some others. Would you agree that Leviticus could be very profitable to look at in some such light as this? Well, Numbers next time raises many of the same matters, and don't hesitate to raise questions about a few things we've left over from Leviticus. You know, some pretty strange and strict rules in there, and we should consider them if you wish. Shall we pray before we go? Our loving Father in heaven, how encouraging it is to us now to see the way in which thou hast sought to win people in the past. We know thou dost possess the same skill, the same marvelous ability to meet us where we are. And no two of us are in the same place and speak a language we can understand. Perhaps this helps us to understand why we have different experiences even in one church, as thou art meeting each one of us where he is. We thank thee too for the assurance that if we need she-bears and thunder, thou art willing to give them to us, unless we've come to the place where even the thunders of Sinai will not move us. But surely if that were the case, we would not be here tonight, seeking to understand thy ways. And as we understand, we are moved to greater admiration for thy wise and gracious ways. We are grateful for that law, we're told, that is part of thy design for this orderly universe, that we become like the person we worship and admire. And as we see thy ways in the Old Testament, we wish we too could be versatile, willing even to run risks of being misunderstood in our efforts to find people and meet them where they are, and speak a language they can understand, and lead them no faster than they are able to follow. We then see Jesus in human form, meeting with prostitutes and tax collectors and drunkards. And many despised him as a drunkard himself, who associated with immoral people. The same God who ran the risks in the Old Testament, we see running the same risk when he lived among us as a human being. And we're asked to deliver the good news and to do it in his way. May this total demonstration of all Scripture lead us to see that we cannot be mechanical about this delivering of the gospel to the world, but that it is a very personal matter to be tailored to each one who listens. We wonder if we could ever do such a thing. Well, we see the model and the promise that we could more and more become like thee. May we then demonstrate in our own churches this ability to be gracious and patient and tolerant and seeking to understand each other and not insist that others move as fast as we think we should and they should too, but to do things thy way. Surely this ancient record is very much present truth to us, and may we have been benefited by it tonight.